Good morning and welcome to the COVID-19 Planning System Changes and the Historic Environment Part 1. This is part of the RTPI Online Series 2020, brought to you by the RTPI South East region. My name is Gareth Giles. I run a planning consultancy in Sussex called Whaleback Planning and Design, and have been a long-standing volunteer for the RTPI South East region. So it's a pleasure to host this event today. After many years of chairing RTPI events in person around the region, this is my first online event. And for all of the constraints, there are clearly opportunities too, as the South East region has never had such a diverse range of delegates at one of its events. It's good to see a colleague from as far north as the Cairngorms National Park Authority. But I think the prize for the most travelled guest today goes to Yvette Black of Jones Lang LaSalle in Poland. If anyone thinks they are further away from my office here in Brighton than Poland, do let me know in the comments section. Please also get involved on Twitter and follow us on @RTPI South East. I must admit that matters of the historic environment are not my strong suit. I completely understand their importance in the planning system, but I'm slightly ashamed to say that I'm not as clued up as I would like to be. So I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what the speakers have to say today and learning alongside our delegates. We have time on our agenda for questions and discussion in around 40 minutes. You can submit your questions during the presentations via the chat section on the right-hand side of your screen. You will select questions to staff option, which myself and Susan will put to speakers during the discussion. So on to our speakers. The first speaker is Natasha Rowland of the National Trust, who is going to speak to us about changes to the permitted development rights and how they impact on heritage heritage assets. So over to you, Natasha.
Is my screen showing, just to check with you?
It is, yes, we can hear you
right.
and see the screen, thank you.
And see the screen, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'd first like to just introduce why the National Trust cares about planning. We are a conservation charity, Europe's largest. We own over and look after more than 500 properties, 775 miles of coastline, and own over 250,000 hectares of land. And we're the UK's largest private landowner. We have a broad range of interest and experience in the planning and built environment and planning specialists in-house, and we engage with planning across a number of contexts, whether that be national or local. I wanted to include this slide just to give you a feeling of the scale and breadth of current changes that's going on in the planning arena currently. I'm sure you're all well aware. But just really wanted to highlight the concern of the pace of change, and really, I think we might all agree the system could do with simplifying, but we think the scale of change actually risks making things more complex and harder to navigate. So this is the list of statutory instruments should you wish to review the details. I've only got time to draw out some of the key concerns, so please have a more detailed read. The changes aim really to support businesses through the pandemic, and they have been brought in to provide flexibility and include things like extending life of planning permissions, outdoor trading and temporary uses for things like camping and caravans and things. Those were an immediate response to the COVID-19, but we know the government is keen to boost housing supply, and with echoes of Prime Minister's mantra of build, 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 there are permanent changes now brought in. I'm going to focus on these here and the implications for the historic environment. Although it's important to note that these are subject to legal challenge at the moment. So the permitted development rights, what are they? You're allowed to create new homes on existing detached blocks of flats and commercial buildings. You can extend existing homes upwards. You can demolish some buildings and construct new dwellings in their place. And probably the major change, which is the change to the use classes order. So extending upwards, what's allowed? For purpose-built blocks of flats and freestanding commercial and mixed-use buildings, above 3 stories, where they're above 3 stories, you can add 2 additional stories. The buildings must not have been built before 1948 or after March 18. There are some maximum height limits which apply. So the roof height cannot extend more than 7 metres over the height of the existing building, 30 metres overall, and there's internal ceiling height restrictions as well. The rights allow for associated engineering operations, and it is subject to a prior approval process. Prior approval being the usual things like transport, highway impacts, external appearance of the building. And for commercial buildings, the prior approval process also includes noise impacts for occupiers, as well as the impacts of introducing the residential use in the area, carrying on any trade, business, or other land in the area, use of other land in the area. For commercial and mixed-use buildings above 2 stories, 2 stories can be added, or where it's 1 story, it's 1 + 1. And that can be on freestanding or terrace buildings of 2 units or more. Again, the time limits apply, but the height limits are lower, being 2 stories. The maximum height is 18 metres, and if it's a terraced or single story property, it's no more than 3.5 metres higher than the existing building of the roof of every other building in the row of a terrace. Again, associated engineering operations and subject to the same prior approval procedures. For the existing houses, again, it's 2 stories plus 2 can be added to detached, semi-detached or terrace properties. The time limits apply and the lower height limits apply. Again, if it's a terraced or single story property, no more than 3.5 metres, and allows the engineering operations and subject to the prior approval. There are some additional provisions to note. It does not include houses in multiple occupation. The external appearance of the materials used must be of similar appearance to that of the existing house. And of course, prior approval is required. Cantering on to the demolition provisions, the demolition of buildings that have been vacant and redundant on the 12th of March, business B1 use, office use, or purpose-built residential blocks can be demolished. It allows all building operations reasonably necessary for the demolition and construction of the new units. And again, prior approval is required for noise impacts and impacts on local businesses operating in the area. There's a maximum footprint here of 1,000 square metres for demolition and maximum height of 18 metres for the new building. It allows freestanding blocks of flats to be put in place, or it could be a single house. And again, height limits apply. Up to 7 metres higher than the old building to accommodate up to 2 additional stories within the overall height limit of 18 metres. And again, the ceiling, floor to ceiling height limit. For demolition, the submission requires a method of demolition of the old building and consideration of plans for landscaping of the development, planning and maintenance of shrubs, etc. And a written statement in respect of heritage and archaeological considerations to be submitted. So what are the safeguards? Important to highlight that none of these rights apply in conservation areas, national parks, the Broads, AONB, SSSIs, World Heritage Sites, and also the safety hazard areas, military explosive storage areas, or within 3 kilometres of the perimeter of an aerodrome. There's no doubt that the prior approval process is built in some positive protections for the local authority to require a wide range of details to be considered, particularly around construction impacts, but also appearance and design of the proposal and the provision of adequate natural light in all habitable rooms of the houses. And where demolition and rebuild is involved, we're pleased to see there are additional safeguards, including heritage and archaeology impacts. For the use class disorder, this really is radical reform. The government considers this is important at the present time as town centres seek to recover from the economic impact of coronavirus, and it gives wide freedom for town centres and uses to support viability. So it creates a new commercial, business and service use class, class E, which replaces the old A1 shops, finances, financial services, restaurants, cafes, etc. And so all changes of use between this class no longer requires any planning permission, of course. There's a new learning and non-residential institution class of F1 and local community under a category of F2 to protect uses important in buildings to local communities. Drinking establishments, hot food takeaways, etc. are removed, so there's more control of those as they go into the list of sui generis things. And just to note, there's some transitional arrangements in place until July 2021. So with all these safeguards, what are our concerns? Well, as a general point, we think the permitted development rules are becoming ever more complex to fathom, and a requirement for planning permission, which is easy to understand, is increasingly being replaced by complex and varied conditions and limitations and prior approvals. The government states they provide a more streamlined planning process with greater planning certainty, while at the same time allowing for local consideration of key planning matters through a light touch prior approval process. Is it really any quicker than a planning application, especially with such substantive matters to be considered? And if there are less planning fees, will local authorities have the resources to give applications sufficient scrutiny? More specifically, we have concerns. Upward extensions could take place in the setting of listed buildings and World Heritage sites and on the edge of conservation areas, and we fear this could cause direct impacts on the significance of heritage assets. The local authority can consider the amenity of building for occupiers and for neighbouring premises, but we're not sure how far that will stretch. And with rebuild, we welcome the heritage and archaeological considerations of the development, and perhaps that could include wider setting. For sensitive landscapes, registered parks and gardens in the World Heritage Site, for example, where there are design views beyond their boundaries and their designations, there's the potential for buildings extending upwards to impact on significance, blocking into visibility of heritage assets. And we also have concern about design quality of homes that will be delivered, and how does this sit with the government's ambition in the planning white paper to create beautiful and high quality places. For existing houses, it requires use of materials similar to existing. Could you just end up with perpetuating bad on bad, which is just higher and more visible? And a further unintended consequence, things like allowing demolition of buildings before 1990 that are not listed and not in a conservation area, could lead to demolition of traditional buildings or ones that are locally listed, which might provide the value of themselves and add character to a place. Those impacts could be on locally listed buildings and local views. And I'm thinking here we're adding 7 meters or 3.5 meters onto existing buildings could have serious visual impacts in a street scene in many places. More generally, we're concerned about the unsustainable development, demolition of buildings being a wasteful resource, which has impacts for materials going to landfill. Rebuild allows for landscaping to be considered, but not other matters to be taken into account, such as green space for local residents, nor does it allow for planning obligations for things like affordable housing. With demolition of B1 uses, whether it offices or light industrial, this could result in housing in remote and inaccessible locations with an absence of access to local facilities. And for the change of use consequences, there's no doubt Class E provides huge flexibility to chop and change between uses. However, the local planning authorities lose control, the ability to control changes between existing, sometimes very different kinds of use, which give rise to different planning considerations. So restrictions between shops, light industrials, whatever the size, whatever the location, whether a business park or an isolated rural location. So our fear is that this may also lead to harm to historic core centres where retail uses may move to out of centre locations, and that may alter the character of historic cores. Also important to note, change of use are excluded from the definition of development. So this means it's something that can't be controlled through an Article 4 direction. Other implications, will we see more Article 4 directions for controlling permitted development rights, particularly in sensitive fringe areas, might be possible, or for the protection of views? Might we see planning conditions trying to limit in new developments, future changes of use to protect areas from change? And then fundamentally, I think local plan policies, what happens with the rebuild of vacant industrial office uses for housing? What does that do for the supply of employment sites in local authorities alongside combinations in losses through change of use? It raises fundamental questions about retail impact assessments, sequential tests, employment land requirements. How can local authorities plan for the right uses in the right places, where changes between many of the uses are now just outside of the scope of planning control altogether? So just very quickly, we have responded to changes to the current planning system, and that is available online if you search on the National Trust's website. And just to highlight, we have responded in detail. Our major concern for heritage is that the permission in principle, we're not confident that heritage and the environment will be considered at an early enough stage. The issues go to the heart of whether a site is acceptable as a matter of principle for the development proposed. And once a permission is granted, there are no planning conditions in planning in principle currently, and it's more difficult to accommodate the sensitivities of a site. We want to see a way of determining what risk of finding unknown archaeology might be. And if it is found, once development begins, there needs to be a way of ensuring this is managed. And I think Peter will touch on these points. We believe major sites really should go through suitable testing first, and that applications for major development should be evidence-based and front-loaded. It is our understanding that PIP could be brought in for several years until the transition to the planning reforms set out in the white paper come in, and that is a concern. And then finally, I won't go these in detail. I know Peter will cover these points, but our approach to the planning white paper, there is some positive in it. It talks about design quality, improving places, but it is lacking in just so much detail. Heritage not fitting distinctly into areas. There's a need for a robust evidence base up front for any permissive system to work. And removing technical assessments at the front end later in the process brings lack of certainty and risks. And so what our asks and concerns of government are is that we really need to understand how strong heritage protections are going to be woven into the new system. We're asking for skills and increased resources for local authorities to manage the new system. And we have a real concern around the timescales and transition periods. And we will be interested to see the detail as it emerges. We want to see further consultation, but I think the biggest risk is going to be poor execution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. As I said, we're going to take questions after all three speakers, so please do use your questions and chat field on your panel. Our next speaker is a returning presenter to our regional events, Peter Hinton, the Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Archaeologists, who will be speaking about the Planning for the Future white paper. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Gareth. Can I just check that I'm audible and the PowerPoint is visible?
Yes, all is well.
Good, thank you very much, and thank you, Natasha. Yes, as Gareth says, I'm here from the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, or CIFA as I will call it for abbreviation, and we're very pleased to be offering this pair of joint seminars with our colleagues at RTPI. And just so that you know who we are, CIFA, we're the leading professional body representing archaeologists in the UK and also overseas. I think if you understand what RTPI is to planning, that's what we are to archaeology. I'm not going to say much on the interim changes that Natasha has talked about, and perhaps interim is a rather kind description of them because they may be with us for some time. Permission in principle obviously is our major concern, and that has serious implications for archaeology. A lot of the other ones may concern us about what it does to the appearance of the historic environment, but less immediate concern. However, the planning white paper has much more significant implications, although there has been greater thought in the planning white paper about safeguards than in the changes that Natasha has just led us through. The most important thing to know about archaeology is that heritage assets with archaeological interests are largely non-designated. They're not listed, they're not scheduled, they're just there, but they are heritage assets and they still need to be dealt with through the planning process. Planning is the only way we have of looking after those assets. They have no other protection. And just to canter you through the current system, it relies on a proportionate staged assessment to inform decisions. to manage opportunities and risks, and I do want to emphasize the opportunities. It's not just about decontaminating sites of inconvenient heritage so that building can go ahead. It's about making sure that development produces interesting, profitable places. So typically at the moment, pre-application discussions, then some assessment either of written records or potentially in the field of the significance of the assets and the potential impact of the development on that significance. Either conditioned, redesigned, mitigation type works to protect the asset, or excavation would be the other way, an offsetting exercise where the fabric is lost but information is gained. That's how it works at the moment. The white paper, of course, is different. As you know, it requires sites to be allocated to these 3 new areas: growth, renewal, and protection. It implies a much stronger role for planning, for plan making and front loading of the system, and there is much to welcome in that. It applies a rules-based development management approach with a lot less discretion, and there are positives in there, but significant risks as well. And of course, it allows for permission in principle or outline permission before any assessment of impact has taken place, and that is a big worry. And our suspicion is that behind these proposals, there is an overestimation of what we already know about the historic environment. Informing those allocations to the different zones, particularly to renewal and growth areas, isn't just about making sure that we've got all the data nicely organized and accessible online in a digital format, because a lot of it isn't there. We're dealing with unknowns. We don't know where many buried assets are. That's one of the features of having things underground. They're not very visible. Indeed, we may know where the buildings with archaeological interest are, but we don't necessarily know that much about them at the stage of allocation. So we think there will be a need to do some targeted research at the allocation stage if we're going to predict better where the sensitivities and opportunities are, and to bring certainty to the developers, to the applicants earlier. And that has big implications for resources. At the moment, all of that targeted research is undertaken by the applicant. In the new system, in these areas, there won't be an applicant. So that private sector cost must fall, unless anyone's got a brighter idea, to the planning authority to undertake or to commission that work. And that's a huge change. So we need to be able to identify those archaeological opportunities for placemaking and all the other good things that archaeology can bring at that allocation stage. And I would like to emphasize, it's not just about risk mapping. We tend as archaeologists to talk about sensitivity mapping and risk mapping, but we should think of archaeology and historic environment as things that help with placemaking and help develop strong communities. So the front loading of the system, the allocation stage, and the granting of permission in principle or outline permission must allow us to manage the remaining unknowns. There will be surprises. There are always surprises in archaeology. We need mechanisms that will address the archaeological needs at technical detail or reserved matters stages. And we do need to know that there will be some mechanism whereby the necessary works can be secured by conditions or some other kind of enforceable agreements. Now, as Natasha said, there's a great lack of detail at the moment, so we don't know how that will be done. But we have managed to blag a meeting with MHCLG after talking to ministers and others about this. We have a few ideas, and we're looking forward to a constructive discussion to try and work that out. I'm going to change tack now just briefly to talk about the role of the archaeological advisor to the local planning authority. they are responsible for a number of very important things, most important of which is a historic environment record. They participate in plan making, in development management, making sure there's enough information for a reliable determination of an application. If archaeological works are required, they may set a brief for that. They will advise on the conditions and, of course, the monitoring and the discharge of those conditions. It's an absolutely critical role. The team must be well resourced, it must be professional, it must be, and I know this is a big issue for the National Trust, it must be confident and capable of making decisions, be brave about its decision making. The white paper would give them even greater responsibilities than they already have, and also a much higher workload, particularly if there is evaluation work needed to ground test the information we already have before allocating sites. In Wales, Historic Environment Record Services are on a statutory footing. There is an obligation on Welsh ministers to ensure that there is one for every local planning authority, a shared one, obviously. In 2009, the Heritage Protection Bill proposed something very similar in England, except that the responsibility was on the local authority to have access to a service. That had cross-party support. The impact assessment showed that it didn't have huge costs, but the bill failed through lack of parliamentary time and the unwelcome arrival of a recession and indeed a new government. At the moment, Historic Environment Record Services are shared between many different authorities, and I suspect they will need further rebrigading, probably fewer but larger with a wider skill set, and potentially alongside other important functions within the local authority, including urban design. That's one of our big asks, but some investment in that will be necessary by government. And I think that ministers have indicated that they understand that this will be an ask. That's not the same thing as saying that it will be acceded to, but I think it is now recognised. We will have to talk to them more about that. So in conclusion, here we have the spiraling vortex of planning and housing. We are facing Storm Robert, or it may be Storm Dominic, it's not quite clear. And one of our concerns is that this is the greenest ever white paper. And there is so much detail missing. As Natasha has said, over the years, the planning process has been simplified into ever greater complexity, and this seems to be potentially another step along the way. We have had ministerial assurances that the intention is not to weaken heritage protection and indeed to strengthen it, but we will have to wait and see. Our position is that the fixes need working out. We have told government that we're nervously positive about the suggestions. There are many great opportunities in here, but of course there are risks that safeguards will be lost, particularly if they are not understood and the issues aren't understood. So definitely once we have argued our way through some detail with government, we would wish to see a second consultation on the detail. Finally, just to say, questions and challenges and help would be welcome, and so would your participation in 3 weeks' time at the follow-up seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Again, leave your questions in the chat and questions tab on the panel. Our final speaker is Scott Lowry, founder and managing director of Ethos Design and Architecture, who will be sharing his perspective on the impact of COVID on both consultants and developers. So over to you, Scott.
That's great. Can everyone see it? Screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. So as Gareth said, thank you, Gareth. My name's Scott Lawrie. I'm the founder and managing director of Ethos. Ethos is an architecture and design practice based in London, Glasgow, in Scotland, and we're working across the UK and internationally. We are very lucky that we frequently get to work with historic buildings and landscapes, and we have a particular interest in the sustainability angle of this as well, which we'll come on to. We also have our own small development company and often have to evaluate the refurbishment and adaptive reuse of these historic buildings and implications in their settings. And my perspective on the COVID planning changes is both from a consultant and from this small development perspective as well. So our short-term concerns in relation to the COVID impacts in particular, I think echoes a lot of the things that's been said. The historic asset owners' income has fallen fantastically since this has all happened, and which will undoubtedly lead to maintenance projects not being carried out and a massive drop in conservation's ability, we are seeing ability to respond. And we can already see that's the same from Historic England in terms of their advisors, and projects are basically being definitely impacted by this, which is not surprising given the amount of people that are having to work from home or out of office environments. In the short term, the planning changes which Boris and the government's view is showing is in terms of the build is fantastic. It just gives us and everyone else this general confusion that is going about at the minute is one of our biggest concerns, and a difficulty interpreting the changes, which again is reiterating, I think, what's been said. I think that general slowing down of the process at the minute is very concerning, given the initiative to build can't really happen if we're in an environment that doesn't actually know what the process is. So added to that, I think what's really concerning from our point of view is then also the point of looking at it from the point of view of my screen is just gone. Can you see? You can still see my. Is then the confusion between the politicians themselves, where you've got one saying build, and you've got Mr. Gold Bagshot stepping up to say not in my backyard. So in terms of the longer term concerns from COVID in particular, we've got a real concern that this impact of working practices and people getting very used to not being within environments that are conducive to that and working from home there is a real worry that this will become a norm, and we are seeing a great deal of issues with mental health, particularly between our younger staff, in terms of being able to get into mentoring and learning interpersonal skills rather than actually just honing up the IT skills. I think we also have a relation of the funding. I think there's been discussed about the drop in the general GDP, and therefore the funding that's going to be made available to historic buildings is undoubtedly going to go, and that has led us to believe that this is going to have to lead to a change of use, potentially increase in terms of making buildings actually be able to pay for themselves going forward in a more commercial way. Turning to the planning changes concerns, from the permitted rights development point of view, of actually carte blanche putting 2 stories onto buildings. Obviously, this is a real concern without a real design approach and pattern book, if you like, of things that should be coming forward with that. And fearful in 30 years' time, people walking about pointing at things, and the only explanation will be is it was about stimulating the economy at the time. I don't see many of these getting listed, and for the avoidance of doubt, none of these are our buildings. Despite all the gloom and concerns, I think we should be looking at also taking the positives of the situation. And in the rush to get back to this normal that we wish to have, it is good to actually take a view of what things have actually impacted that mean a real difference to us in the future. And I think the reclamation of getting back spaces that have been given over historically to vehicles in particular, and historic environment spaces, streets, townscapes, definitely needs to be considered, especially with the implications of reinvigorating the high streets in particular, which has come out of a huge impact of the COVID impact on retail sales, etc. I think the other big thing for us is making a huge public knowledge of, having the public not being able to travel and having restricted access to all of our fantastic heritage sites. A great appreciation will hopefully come out of these going forward in the future. To conclude, I thought it was interesting that in the white papers and Mr. Generick's speeches, etc., he's used a series of quotes, one which we build, let's think that we build forever. And that got us thinking that potentially that's fine, but buildings may have to change use more, as I've said, to be more commercially viable, like the likes of Butler's Wharf. And I think one of the things that hasn't come across is there's a recent Historic England study showing that the carbon emissions could be reduced by up to 60% by 2050 as a result of increasing refurbishment, retrofitting of older properties. And I think that is extremely critical to make sure that we've actually got a real ability for innovative developers to feel that heritage buildings in particular and these types of settings are not a huge risk in comparison to just building new build. And I think if we can do that with an understanding of what permissible rights would be within these buildings or changes of uses, that would certainly help de-risk the projects, which when you see good innovative development that happens with these, the likes of Urban Splash and St William's Yard in Plymouth or Manhattan Loftus and Pancras, these actually produce fantastic results to keep the buildings then in perpetuity. And so to end on, I would use another quote from Mr. Jenick that, from Clough Williams, to cherish the past, adorn the present and construct the future, which is a fantastic message. But I think we have to, with the build that we're being asked to do, is it comes back to, I think, echoing the statements earlier, that the government needs to invest in exactly the people who are running the council side of the process, in particular to help de-risk the process of the planning and the list of building approvals. Otherwise, there is a risk that we will see people not wanting to carry on and complete purchases of buildings and actually move it forward. And I hope that repetition isn't too much, but given I'm the last speaker, it's not surprising, I suppose, in some ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. So that concludes the speakers' presentations. We will be fielding a few questions now, but do still post any questions you have for any of the three speakers in the questions part of the panel. Perhaps we can take some questions in order of the speakers' presentations. So a question for Natasha, first of all. You did touch on this during your presentation about potential impact of PD rights on heritage assets, but I suppose the question is that the new rights for roof extensions are restricted within conservation areas, but not within the setting of listed buildings, for example, that are not in conservation areas. And you know, you mentioned intervisibility and so on like that. Is that a big risk, and what do you think the government could do to adjust in the next batch of regulations, which will inevitably follow shortly?
I really do think it is a big risk, which is why I sort of wanted to sort of labour the point about heights, really, and the little photos that Scott showed were really useful in that respect as well. I think in terms of what could be done, I think it's really the comment about Article 4 directions, because the power is there for local authorities to control what happens on the edge of these very sensitive locations. And perhaps there will be some guidance, you would hope, in NPPF and as revisions come through, you know, for the planning system. You know, we've got, as Scott mentioned quite rightly, you know, we've got these new PD rights, but we haven't got the design codes yet. We haven't got the detail that is being promised with white paper. And at the moment, it's all just a bit disjointed, I think. Yeah, I think that hopefully answers that point.
Thank you very much. You also mentioned you used the phrase light touch for the prior approval process. I mean, I completely agree. Obviously, we're a private practice that have been asked by clients to look at these options from the beginning of September. And once you start working through the different criteria of the new prior approval regulations, it's almost like a full planning application. There's very few differences actually, and there's some very vague criteria like appearance and design included in some of them as well. I mean, from your perspective, do you and the National Trust think that this actually will be a more streamlined process, or perhaps not? And if it's not, then are there actually any benefits over a planning application, particularly with the risks to heritage assets that you've mentioned?
I think, you know, there's some real issues around the permitted development rights. Are they going to be used? I suspect a lot of people will look at the list and think, actually, we'll just put an application in, particularly in areas where, you know, London, particular areas where they know that building up is probably going to be acceptable. I think the issue will come with when local authority, when developers have an issue perhaps otherwise with where a principle of development would be unacceptable. So if it's a rural location, it might be an existing commercial premises in a rural location. They don't have to go through demonstrating it's a suitable site for development and the principle of development is acceptable. They can simply go through the details. And I think that's probably where it's going to be used most. That would be my feeling and concern. Because, you know, we don't know what it's going to lead to. A lot of our registered parks and gardens, as you can expect, are in, you know, beautiful countrysides. Not all are AONB and so will be excluded, or national parks. I can think of Fountain Abbey, for example. We've got some AONB, but it doesn't extend completely all the way around. Ripon, in which it's located very close to, has a conservation area, but it's not all conservation area. And unless we can persuade the local authority there to perhaps look at Article 4 directions, there could be some real issues.
Thank you. I agree. And I think another point, if I've read it correctly, is that prior approvals used to be limited in time. And if the local authority missed the deadline, it would be a deemed consent. But I think some, if not all, of the new rights don't have that clause. So actually, there's no specific consequences for the LPA not to determine it in time, so it doesn't even necessarily become quicker than a planning application. But that's very interesting. Thank you. And another question is, do you see any implications of the changes for things like heritage impact assessments, heritage statements, and so on going forwards on these different types of applications?
Yes, I think you know, if you have a new development that's required to have a heritage impact assessment, how can you produce an assessment of what a potential skyline might be? And it has the same ramifications for landscape and visual impact assessments. And how is that all going to be played out? And how, you know, what is the baseline in what you're assessing? So yeah, that is a concern. I mean, I think there is some protection and safeguard for the demolition and rebuild of a specific site for housing where you have to submit heritage and archaeological considerations, and I think the local authority can request information to assess risks and impacts. So there might be some safeguards there, but in other locations it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Thank you. So another question has just popped up from BCP Council. It's not directed to any speaker in particular, but it's about waste management. So if anyone has any thoughts on this, do jump in. It says there is a focus on developing buildings more sustainably. In my experience, I find change of use from commercial to residential frequently lack consideration for waste management. The Waste Collection Authority are limited to stipulating waste collection requirements in pre-apps, but I suppose perhaps not in the applications. What are your thoughts on this? Is there a possibility prior approval processes can be altered to account for good waste management practice?
I can answer that if it helps, Gareth.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, I didn't have the time to run through, I'm afraid, the huge list of caveats to the prior approval risks. Things. It does include things like safe exit, fire exits, buildings, staircases on side of buildings. It includes waste provision and certain criteria where the waste provision and management considerations that the authority can ask about, no further forward of the existing building, not to the side of the building. So there's obviously clearly got to be space for it. And it would be quite legitimate for the local authority to say, well, how are you going to manage, services going forward?
Thank you. There's another question on the very similar lines, actually, so I won't repeat it, but I think people are quite interested in that. Moving on to a few questions for Peter. You mentioned actually in your presentation as well that we don't often know where archaeology is until it starts to be dug up, for example. How realistic is it that government will make funds available to enable planning authorities to undertake that targeted research that you spoke about, which is currently paid for by applicants through the current planning system?
Well, Gareth, I wish I knew the answer to that question. It's a really tricky one, but I think the answer has to be that this new process requires information earlier in the system because the centre has been hollowed out to get decision making earlier in the process. If the government wants this system to work, if it wants to get away from the negotiated approach at development management stage, then there does need to be more information at the beginning for the developer and for the applicant, and it will be, as far as I can see, it has to be the planning authority that provides that. So if the government understands the issues and wants it to work, it will have to find this money. If not, I'm afraid the consequences will be that permission in principle or similar will be granted at the beginning of the process. Unexpected surprises will occur more often. The costs and the delays will appear later in the planning stage, and so in fact certainty will have been reduced, and the certainty will come much later in the process. So it utterly depends on good investment at the front, and I think the message we have to get across to the government is that involves a shift in resources. And you can't get a new planning system free of charge.
I would completely agree, and from my time in the past working for local planning authorities myself, I remember every time a new PPG or something came out that had new requirements for LPAs, people would always ask, well, who's going to pay for councils to resource these staff to sort of undertake these exercises, introduce things like SIL, and it's very often big ideas from government without any extra money. So I think we'd all agree with you there.
The consistent messaging from all parts of the sector, from all interests, is that the principal grumble about planning services is they're under-resourced, underskilled in some cases, and that can be dealt with through investment.
And actually, there was a comment popped up during Scott's presentation, actually, given some of his comments along the same lines, that just popped up and said, great to hear someone from the private sector recognising the importance of investment in the public sector. Well, I would say that's not a surprise to me. I think everyone in the private sector thinks the public sector need more money as well, absolutely. That's it, and a lot of us in the private sector, a lot of people used to work at the public sector, but we're all in the same industry trying to achieve the same outcomes on the whole. And I think Peter just did touch on this a minute ago, but there is a sort of potential that permission in principle is granted and then significant archaeology is found, and that's challenging because there might not be the sort of watching brief conditions and mitigation that you would expect to see attached to a planning permission normally being in place in those scenarios.
Yeah, we will have to have some mechanism put in place that allows a level of detail and a level of assessment and a response to be introduced, even though permission in principle has been granted. And it's those techie details are all very dull, but they're critical to the success of these proposals, and that's what we need to talk to MHCLG officials about. And I'm glad that we are being encouraged to talk to them about that, and I think we'll just have to explore that together. One of a sacrifice that we will be making if we continue with our line of which I characterized as nervous optimism, is that it will be very, very hard to take away a permission if something so significant is found that people might wish to do that. I'm thinking, for those of you with long memories, Rose Theatre type occurrences back in the 1980s. I think we're prepared to live with that. We're prepared to live with the fact that an asset that, had we known it was there, we would have wished to preserve, could be lost. I think we can live with that because of the rarity of its occurrence if the rest of the system is made to work better. And it does have the potential to allow for a more targeted, more thoughtful, more interesting, more holistic approach to archaeology with greater public benefits than the relatively piecemeal approaches we have at the moment. At present, the figures for actually refusing an application on archaeological grounds are minuscule. It's less than 1 in 10,000, possibly less than 1 in 100,000. An archaeological response is often required, but it's about 1 a year where archaeology or historic environment is cited as one of the reasons for an outright refusal.
Thank you, very insightful. There's a question for Scott here, if I can just find it. How do you see the design codes evolving and their impact in relation to PD, also timescales? I suppose that comes back to your point in your presentation about sort of the absence of design codes at the moment means it's all a bit up in the air.
I think there should be a generic approach overall, and then a devolved approach to it within each of the contextual areas that local authorities are going to work in. Many are going to be different scenarios between different types of boroughs or scenarios that you're working in. One doesn't fit all, I don't think. One approach will not fit all from a design, and it needs to be tweaked. You need to have a standard approach to doing it, and then a much more specific approach for each of the localized types of scenarios you might be dealing with. Are you going to stick 2 stories on top of a thatched cottage? No. There's different approaches to different things, I think, but within a standard overall approach to it.
I mean, I think that's fair. And the second part of that question was about timescales, and this is something that I've sort of reflected on in the last month or so, is that some councils take 10 years to adopt a local plan. How realistic is it that they're going to be able to adopt presumably multiple different design codes across their districts and boroughs in a realistic amount of time?
And people understand what is actually going to be permitted rather than not, because it's all about the risk of taking a project on with an understanding of what you will get out of it, whatever scale it's at.
Absolutely. And I suppose the other speakers have sort of put forward some points that they would like to make to ministers and departments in the government. What do you have sort of a top 3 things that you would like to put forward that would make these changes and ongoing changes better for consultants like yourself?
I think it's about the understanding of risk. I mean, developers hate spending fees at the best of times. And I think when we're in such a difficult, economic sort of development cycle now that we're in, I think it's the understanding of how many fees you actually need to be putting into a system. And I'm on both sides of that fence, wanting the fees to be paid, but understanding from a risk point of view what you're actually going to pay fees for. So I think that risking, especially with historic buildings, which are historic, that have always been seen as a bigger risk for developers because of I think the investment, and particularly in people with much better historic environment type costing analysis, and on the planning side as well, so that there could be a real understanding of meeting the minds when you actually sit down to evaluate a project. That type of thing. And I think the other thing is investment has to happen quickly also in maintaining the sort of apprenticeships and the historic fabric people that are going to actually miss out on potentially years of non-investment, and therefore will lose all the skills.
We actually had a question earlier about sort of councils have been cutting costs for many years, and often it's long-standing expertise like heritage advisors, which are one of those resources that are lost, and they're sort of posing an open question saying sort of, what now if all of that expertise and resources gone? How do we get it back? But I suppose there is no answer to that. I don't suppose. Just maybe apprenticeships, perhaps. another follow-up question, Scott. As an architect, do you worry that the design codes may limit architectural freedom?
Only if they're wrong. I think you've got to, if the policy is not right, I think a good architect will always come back and challenge it. So I think there has to be something in there to actually act as a guide, and it gives a bit more confidence that things will be accepted or information will be needed on certain aspects of it. So I think that, you know, it shouldn't be an inhibitor. It should actually be a good starting point to actually take a project forward.
Thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze one or two more questions in. This one's actually a very good question. It might be sort of split to everyone, but potentially to Natasha and Scott as a sort of heritage and developer hats on both of you. It's something that also came into our practice in Whaleback this week. It's the question that the changes of use, the new PD rights and the changes of the use class order don't relate to listed buildings. But heritage assets and listed buildings may suffer from years of underinvestment if their use becomes unviable, particularly say, you know, offices that are no longer fit for purpose and so on and so forth. Essentially, the question is saying, is it not a better idea to have greater flexibility for these changes of use, even in listed buildings? Obviously, there's pros and cons, but do you have any thoughts on that?
I suppose from my perspective, it's, you know, the government advice and everything that we support is the careful management of change. And the white paper, the planning white paper, talks about being more encouraging for, you know, adaptive uses of listed buildings. It talks about climate change and being able to adapt things, and that could be, you know, a way forward. It can be done, and we know it can be done. It just has to have the proper guidance in place and the proper assessments up front.
I mean, I think our view at the time, and I'm still trying to formulate what my thoughts are on this, but I think that a change of use in itself won't damage or harm a listed building. It's about any physical alterations which might cause consequence, but you'd always need a listed building consent for those changes. So I don't really see what the problem is with allowing permitted changes of use, as long as applicants and owners understand that any alterations physically will need an LBC.
Yes, that's right, and that's what the regulations are there for. You know, as soon as it's any physical works, internal or external, then that is captured.
So it does seem a little harsh, perhaps, that the change of use rights don't apply to listed buildings. One more question for Natasha, just in the last moment. Could the National Trust suggest that local listed buildings should have PD rights removed? This would be very helpful.
That's an interesting one, and one that's not come up in discussion. So perhaps that's one for me to take away and debate internally.
Great. I suppose that was meant to say locally listed buildings rather than listed buildings in the local area. But yeah, good question.
But you're right. It is something that's very important, locally listed buildings. And if you think of neighbourhood plans and the future role, what role is neighbourhood planning going to have in the new planning system? You know, they could be a lot stronger in terms of design codes and helping design codes come forward and things, and perhaps there is a stronger role there for identifying, as they do now, locally listed buildings, but maybe a bit more bite to it.
Absolutely, and we won't get into non-designated heritage assets. So I will draw it to a close then. We're going to try and stick to the time. So thank you to our speakers today for their presentations, and to all of our delegates for your attendance, and also for your questions that have been streaming in during the discussion segment. Please do post your thoughts on Twitter and complete the survey that will appear once this webinar finishes. You can also subscribe to the RTPI YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/the RTPI. So you're notified of all the new RTPI videos as they are released, and they really are ramping up their publishing of videos at the moment in the circumstances. A recording of this particular session will also be going up soon. So if you're watching the recording of this, please leave a comment below the video. We'd still like to hear your thoughts and give this video a thumbs up. Also, to everybody, join us for part 2 of the event on the 18th of November at 11 AM. And for more details of that, please visit our website. Thank you very much, and goodbye.